The air in the Greenwich Country Club ballroom was thick with the scent of hydrangeas and old money. It was a suffocating perfume, one I'd never gotten used to. From my table in the back, I watched my son, Leo, standing at the center of the room, bathed in the warm glow of rented chandeliers. He looked perfect. His tuxedo was tailored by someone who charged more than my first truck cost, and his smile was as bright and polished as the silverware on the tables. Beside him, his new bride, Amelia, glowed, and beside them both stood Marcus Thorne, Amelia's father. My replacement. I ran a thumb over the calluses on my palm. They were a roadmap of my life, etched by lumber, steel, and concrete. They didn't belong here, in this room of soft hands and softer men. I was Frank Miller, owner of Miller & Sons Construction. The Sons part was aspirational. It was always just me. I build things, foundations that last, houses that become homes. That's what I do. It's a simple, honest truth. A truth my son had spent his entire life trying to escape. The clinking of a fork against a crystal glass brought the room to a hush. It was time for the toast. Before the dinner, during a quiet moment, I'd handed Leo my gift. A simple, unadorned briefcase of dark, heavy leather. No brand name stamped on it, no flashy buckles. Just quality that spoke for itself. He'd taken it with a tight, dismissive smile. "Thanks, Dad," he'd said, the words as hollow as a cheap door. He set it aside without a second glance. Now he raised his glass. "I want to thank you all for being here," he began, his voice smooth, practiced. He'd learned that voice at Yale, a place I'd paid for by renovating half the brownstones in New Haven. He thanked Amelia's family. He thanked his friends. The room was a sea of adoring, smiling faces. My son, the center of his own universe. Then his eyes found mine. For a fleeting second, I saw the boy I used to know, the one who'd held my hand at his mother's funeral. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by a cold, resolute hardness. He took a breath, and the smile on his face became something else, something sharp. "And I want to make a special toast," he said, his voice ringing with a strange, triumphant clarity. "To my father, Frank." A polite, scattered applause rippled through the room. I didn't move. I just watched him. He held his glass higher, his gaze locked on me. "I've hated you all my life," he said. The room didn't just go quiet. The silence was a physical thing, a vacuum that sucked the air from my lungs. Every smile froze, every whisper died. It was the sound of 100 people holding their breath. He didn't falter. He turned his body slightly, away from me and toward the man standing next to him, towards Marcus Thorne. "But now I have a new father, and I'm happy." 11 words. That's all it took to detonate my world. Leo wrapped his arm around Marcus Thorne's shoulders. Thorne, with his silver hair and predatory grace, placed a hand on Leo's back, a perfect picture of paternal pride. He gave me a brief, almost imperceptible nod, a nod of victory. Pain is a funny thing. It's a signal. It tells you where the damage is. For a moment, it was a hot, white spike behind my eyes. The image of my late wife, Sarah, her face tired but hopeful. "Be patient with him, Frank. He just wants to fly so high he can't see the ground." But then, something else took over. The part of me that doesn't feel. The part that calculates. The part that builds. Or when necessary, the part that demolishes. The pain receded, replaced by a glacial calm. The same calm my crews see right before I fire a man for cutting corners or tell a client their entire foundation needs to be ripped out. It's the calm that precedes the storm. I didn't say a word. I didn't cause a scene. Humiliation is a weapon, and in their world of appearances, they had just handed me a loaded one. I met my son's defiant gaze for one last second. He looked proud. He looked free. He had no idea he'd just signed his own death warrant. And Marcus Thorne's. Slowly, I pushed my chair back. The scrape of its legs on the polished floor was obscenely loud in the dead silence. I stood up, straightened the lapels of my simple, off-the-rack suit, and turned my back on my son, on his new bride, on his new father. I just walked out. The sound of my work boots on the marble floor of the lobby echoed like hammer blows. Each step was a decision. Each echo was a promise. They thought they had one. They thought they had cast out the simple, dirt-under-his-fingernails builder. They didn't understand. You don't build an empire with soft hands. And you don't protect it by being a nice guy. The lesson was about to begin, and the tuition was going to be everything they had. The engine of my 20-year-old Ford F-150 turned over with a familiar, comforting grumble. The cracked leather of the steering wheel felt more real under my hands than anything in that sterile ballroom. I pulled out of the country club's manicured parking lot, leaving the orchestra of luxury sedans and sports cars behind. I didn't look back. The highway stretched out before me, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the Connecticut darkness. The radio was off. The only sound was the hum of the tires on the pavement and the rush of the wind. My mind, however, was deafeningly loud. 11 words. They played on a loop, each one a separate blow. Yves hated you all my life. Did he? I suppose he did. I was never the father he wanted. I didn't go to his parent-teacher conferences. I missed his championship soccer game. I wasn't there for his graduation from Yale. I was in Zurich for that one, cleaning up a mess for a client who thought digital currency was untraceable. I sent a wire transfer for a new car and a hollow apology. He wanted a father who wore a suit to breakfast, who talked about stocks and mergers, who vacationed in the Hamptons. Instead, he got me. A man who smelled of sawdust and welding flux, whose idea of a good time was a cold beer and a quiet sunset. A man whose phone would ring at 3 a.m., and I'd be gone for a week with no explanation other than, "It's work, Leo." He never understood what work was. How could he? My life was a carefully constructed facade. Miller and Sons was real. It was my passion, my anchor to the tangible world. But it was also the perfect cover. The unassuming, blue-collar contractor from Connecticut. Nobody looks twice at the guy in the pickup truck. Nobody suspects he's the one who designed the security protocols for the new federal gold depository or engineered the logistics for a corporate extraction out of Venezuela. I build things. That's the truth. But I don't just build with wood and steel. I build systems, networks, firewalls, and traps. My hands tighten on the wheel. I thought of Sarah. Towards the end, when the cancer had taken everything but her spirit, we had a conversation that now felt like a prophecy. We were sitting on the porch of the house I'd built for us, the house Leo couldn't wait to leave. "He's ashamed of you, Frank," she'd said, her voice a fragile whisper. "He doesn't see the strength. He only sees the dirt on your hands. He's a good kid, Sarah. He's just ambitious." She'd looked at me with those knowing eyes, the only person on earth who knew both versions of Frank Miller. "No, he's naive. And his ambition makes him a target for men like the ones he used to work for. Men like Marcus Thorne." Even then, she saw it. She saw the glitter in Thorne's eyes every time he looked at Leo, not as a future son-in-law, but as an asset, an entry point. "Promise me," she'd said, her grip on my hand surprisingly strong. "Protect him, Frank, even from himself, especially from himself." I had promised, and for the past 6 months, I had been honoring that promise in the only way I knew how. Not with lectures or heartfelt talks. He was beyond that. I was honoring it by building the most intricate, inescapable trap of my entire career. I bypassed the turnoff to my quiet, respectable suburban home. Leo knew that house. That was where Frank, the contractor, lived. But that wasn't where I was going tonight. I kept driving, heading towards the industrial outskirts of Bridgeport, where the skeletons of old factories clawed at the night sky. I pulled into a desolate, chain-link-fenced lot fronting a massive, windowless corrugated steel warehouse. From the outside, it looked abandoned, condemned, even. But as I approached the single, unmarked service door, a discreet panel glowed green. I placed my eye to the retinal scanner and my palm on the plate below it. There was a low hiss of hydraulics and a heavy thump as a dozen magnetic locks disengaged. The steel door swung inward, revealing nothing but absolute darkness. I stepped across the threshold, and the door sealed shut behind me with the finality of a bank vault. The world of Frank Miller, simple builder, was locked outside. The man who stepped into the darkness was someone else entirely. The man Sarah called my architect. It was time to go my real home. It was time to get to work. A soft click echoed in the darkness, and the space was flooded with cool, indirect light. The warehouse wasn't a dusty, forgotten shell. It was a command center, My workshop. The vast, open-plan space was a study in controlled chaos. One wall was a seamless bank of monitors, some displaying architectural blueprints for my current construction projects, others glowing with silent, cascading lines of code, real-time stock market tickers, and encrypted satellite feeds. In the center of the room, a massive oak table, one I'd built myself, was covered in schematics, legal documents, and burner phones. The air didn't smell of sawdust. It hummed with the quiet, relentless power of servers and cooling fans. This was my sanctuary, the place where the two halves of my life merged. The blueprints for a historic library restoration in Boston sat next to a detailed analysis of offshore banking regulations in the Cayman Islands. It was all construction, just of a different kind. I walked over to a simple locker, removed my wedding suit, and hung it up. It felt like shedding a costume. I pulled on a comfortable black Henley and a pair of worn jeans. This was my uniform. This was me. On the main monitor, I pulled up a single, encrypted folder. The file name was simple, Project Air. I'd opened the file 6 months ago, the day after Leo announced his engagement to Amelia Thorne. I like Marcus Thorne. On the surface, he's charming, witty, and has the kind of easy confidence that comes from generations of wealth. Or, at least, the appearance of it. But I don't trust men who wear their watches looser than their morals. For half a year, I had dedicated my nights to a deep, silent, and completely illegal dive into every corner of Marcus Thorne's life and his company, Thorne Capital. I didn't use hackers. I didn't need to. Most of the world's financial security systems are built on frameworks I helped design 2 decades ago. I didn't have to break down the doors. I still had the master keys. The data scrolled across the screen. A mosaic of disaster, painted in the language of finance. Falsified earnings reports. Leveraged assets that didn't exist. A dizzying network of shell corporations shuffling debt from one phantom entity to another. The truth was stark and simple. Marcus Thorne wasn't just struggling. He was broke. Catastrophically so. Thorne Capital wasn't an investment firm. It was a Ponzi scheme on the verge of collapse, hemorrhaging money so fast he was weeks, maybe days, away from total implosion. The lavish wedding, the country club membership, the veneer of untouchable wealth. It was all a frantic, desperate show. He was a drowning man looking for a life raft. And he thought he'd found one in me. I pulled up a separate file, a dossier my contacts had compiled on Thorne's recent inquiries. He'd been quietly digging into my finances, trying to assess my net worth. The reports were comical. They estimated Miller & Sons Construction at a respectable, but not staggering, 8 figures. They saw my modest house, my old truck, my simple life. They concluded I was a small-time, cash-rich contractor who'd gotten lucky. Dumb money. Easy for the taking. Thorne's plan was painfully obvious. Marry his daughter to my son. Welcome Leo into the family business. And then, using my son as leverage, convince the simple builder to make a substantial, life-saving investment in Thorne Capital to secure his son's glorious future. He would have drained me dry and then cut Leo loose when the whole thing inevitably collapsed. He wasn't gaining a son-in-law. He was acquiring a mark. I took a slow sip of the coffee brewing on a machine in the corner. It was black and bitter. My son wasn't just a fool. He was a pawn in a game he didn't even know was being played. His public declaration of hatred, his embrace of Thorne as a new father, it wasn't just a personal betrayal. It was the final, critical error of a naive boy stepping into a predator's den. I looked at the screen, at the intricate web of debt and deceit Thorne had woven. He thought he was a spider. He had no idea he'd just walked into my web. For months, my plan had been a contingency, a defensive measure to protect the promise I made to Sarah. But what happened tonight, it changed the equation. This was no longer about protection. It was about education. It was about raising a condemned structure to its foundations so something new, something stronger, could be built in its place. I navigated to the final subfolder in Project Air. Inside was a single, executable file labeled Asset Transfer. Everything was in place. Every domino was perfectly aligned. All it needed was a trigger. My son had just pulled it for me. You know what's funny about rich people like Marcus Thorne? They think in terms of money. Stocks, bonds, wire transfers, bearer bonds. They see wealth as a number on a screen, a tangible thing that can be acquired, spent, or stolen. That's why they're so easy to fool. They never see the trap because they're looking for the wrong kind of bait. When I handed Leo that leather briefcase, I saw the flicker of disappointment in his eyes. He probably expected a stock portfolio from a blue-chip company, or maybe the keys to a condo on Central Park South. Something gaudy and immediate. Something a new father like Marcus Thorne would give. He weighed it in his hand and felt only the heft of paper and leather. He felt nothing. He was wrong. What he held in his hand was the heaviest thing in that entire ballroom. It was the weight of an entire empire. Let me tell you what was inside. It wasn't a check. A check can be torn up. It wasn't a stock certificate. A stock can be sold. It wasn't cash. Cash is for amateurs. No, what I gave my son was something far more elegant, far more permanent. For the last 6 months, while I was overseeing the reinforcement of a pre-war bridge in upstate New York, I was also making quiet calls. I have a very particular network of contacts, men and women in places like Zurich, Hong Kong, and Dubai who specialize in the discreet acquisition of distressed assets. They don't have company websites. They don't have business cards. They exist only as encrypted numbers in a handful of phones around the world. My instructions to them were simple. Buy Marcus Thorne's debt. All of it. They went to the hedge funds in Delaware that were quietly trying to offload his toxic loans. They went to the European banks he'd charmed into extending his credit lines one last time. They even went to the private, less than reputable lenders in Macau he'd turned to in his desperation. They bought it all for pennies on the dollar, because everyone in the real world of finance knew Thorne was already a ghost. He was just too arrogant to lie down. I funneled the funds through a dozen shell corporations, a labyrinth of transactions that would take the SEC a decade to unravel. By the time it was done, every single dollar Marcus Thorne owed in the world, a staggering sum that ran into the billions, was no longer held by a disparate group of angry creditors. It was held by a single, unified entity. And that brings me to the centerpiece of my gift. The documents in that briefcase were the articles of incorporation for a newly minted holding company. I had my lawyers in Panama draw them up last week. The company's name is LS Legacy Holdings. L for Leo, S for Sarah. The sole asset of LS Legacy Holdings is the consolidated multi-billion-dollar mountain of debt I had acquired. The company owns nothing else. It produces nothing. It has only one function: to be the legal master of Marcus Thorne's financial existence. The final pages in that briefcase were the most important. A legally airtight, notarized, and irrevocable transfer of 100% ownership of LS Legacy Holdings to its new chairman and CEO, Leo Miller. My son. As of the moment he opened that briefcase and his lawyers explained the documents to him, Leo would become Marcus Thorne's sole creditor. His only creditor. The man he just called his new father, on a stage in front of 200 people, now owed his entire existence to the son he had just helped humiliate. Every asset Thorne had was leveraged against that debt. His penthouse in Manhattan, his estate in Greenwich, his art collection, his company. Every last paperclip at Thorne Capital was collateral, and my son now held the note. I didn't give Leo money. Money is a tool for the weak. I gave him something Thorne values infinitely more: control. I gave him a leash. I gave him the power to either pull his new family back from the abyss or to kick them into it. I didn't just set a trap for Marcus Thorne. That would have been too crude. I built a brand new kingdom, forged from the wreckage of his own. And then I handed the crown to the one person he thought he had completely under his thumb. The wedding toast wasn't an insult. It was a coronation. My son just didn't know it yet. The call came 3 days later. I knew it would. I was on a job site in Hartford, perched on a steel beam 50 feet above the ground, checking the torque on a series of structural bolts. The morning sun was sharp, the air crisp with the smell of cut metal. It was honest work, real work. My phone, a simple rugged flip phone I used for the business, vibrated in my pocket. The caller ID was a satellite number, blocked and untraceable. Paradise. I gestured to my foreman, a good man named Dave, who's worked with me for 30 years. I'm taking 5, I yelled over the whine of a power saw. I found a quiet spot, flipped open the phone, and said nothing. For a few seconds, all I heard was the faint sound of waves and panicked breathing. Then Leo's voice, raw and frayed. "What did you do?" It wasn't a question. It was an accusation, an unraveling. "Good morning, Leo," I said calmly. "I trust the Maldives are as beautiful as the brochures." Don't do that," he shrieked, his voice cracking. "Don't do that calm, condescending thing. I'm sitting here with Amelia, who's been crying for 6 hours, and 3 lawyers on a conference call who can't make any sense of this. What is LS Legacy Holdings? Why does it say I own him?" I could picture the scene perfectly. Him, tanned and terrified in some billion-dollar resort bungalow, the pristine white sand and turquoise water a mocking backdrop to the implosion of his perfect, fabricated life. He'd probably open the briefcase as a curiosity, a final look at a gift from his past before embracing his new future. He and Amelia would have laughed at the boring legal documents. Then they would have called their lawyer, expecting a simple explanation, and the world would have ended. "The documents are quite clear, Leo," I said, my voice even. "I would have thought a Yale education would have prepared you for this. You're the sole proprietor of a holding company. It's a wedding gift. Congratulations." "A gift? This is a bomb." "Marcus, his lawyers are saying. They're saying this company has the right to call in all his debts. Immediately. They're saying it could wipe him out in a single day." "Is that true?" "That's generally what happens when you owe someone money and they ask for it back," I said. A choked, desperate sound came down the line. "But why? Why would you do this? To ruin him? To ruin me? You did this because of what I said at the wedding, didn't you? This is revenge." I sighed, not with pity, but with a profound weariness. He still didn't get it. He was seeing the explosion, but he couldn't comprehend the architecture of the bomb. "Leo," I said, my tone changed. The contractor was gone. The architect was speaking now. "Let me explain this to you once, and I want you to listen very carefully. Your father-in-law, the man you so proudly embraced, is a fraud. His company is an empty shell propped up by lies. He's been bankrupt for years, and he's been robbing his clients to keep the lights on. He wasn't welcoming you into his family. He was targeting mine. He saw you as a bridge to my money, which he incorrectly assumed was both vast and managed by an idiot." Silence on the other end. The waves seemed to get louder. "He was going to use you, bleed my company dry, and then leave you with nothing but the smoldering wreckage and a part in a federal indictment. I have the proof. I have every falsified document, every illegal transfer. It's all backed up on a server that the SEC would give their left kidney to access." I let that sink in. "What I did," I continued, "was not an act of revenge. It was an act of preservation. I took a collapsing structure and I transferred its ownership. The bomb was already armed, Leo. Thorne armed it himself over 10 years of fraud and arrogance. All I did was change who was holding the detonator." He was quiet for a long time. I could hear his mind racing, the gears grinding as the world he thought he knew dissolved into smoke. What do I do?" he finally whispered. "That's the beauty of the gift, son," I said, looking out over the city skyline, a landscape of concrete and steel I understood perfectly. "For the first time in your life, you get to decide. You can liquidate the company's assets, which means calling in the debt and destroying Marcus Thorne utterly. Or you can do nothing, and his house of cards will fall on its own in a few weeks anyway. Or you can try to find another way. You are now the architect of your new father's fate. You wanted his life. You wanted his power. Now you have it. All of it." I paused, then added the final piece. "Make your choice, Leo. But understand this. Your choice will define who you are. Not who your father is, or who you want him to be. Who you are. Welcome to the world of consequences." I flipped the phone shut without waiting for a reply. I looked at the bolt I was supposed to be checking. Everything was built on a foundation. Finance, family, a man's character. And Marcus Thorne's was built on sand. The tide was coming in. Wall Street operates on 2 things, greed and fear. For a decade, Marcus Thorne had masterfully manipulated the first. Now, he was about to be consumed by the second. Back in my workshop, I didn't have to do anything. The system I had built was automated. a self-executing demolition sequence. The moment the ownership of LS Legacy Holdings was legally transferred to Leo, a series of digital tripwires were activated. The first was a quiet inquiry submitted through a third-party legal firm in Zurich to one of Thorn's primary lenders in Germany, Deutsche Bank. The inquiry was simple. On behalf of our client, the new sole owner of your outstanding loan portfolio related to Thorn Capital, we request immediate verification of the collateralized assets listed under Agreement 7B, 41. It was a phantom request about a non-existent clause. But in the hyper-nervous world of high finance, a question like that from an unknown entity is like a whiff of smoke in a munitions factory. It creates panic. The bank's risk assessment algorithms would flag it instantly. Who is this new owner? Why were they scrutinizing the collateral? Within hours, the whisper started. Digital chatter on encrypted financial forums. A nervous phone call from a Frankfurt banker to a contact in London. The rumor mill on Wall Street is faster and more vicious than any news wire. Something is wrong at Thorn Capital. By the time the markets opened in New York the next morning, the seed of fear had sprouted. Thorn Capital stock, already propped up by nothing but Thorn's charisma, dipped a few points. Then the second tripwire. An anonymous, encrypted data packet was dropped into the lap of a notoriously aggressive financial journalist at the Wall Street Journal. The packet contained just one document, a single, heavily redacted balance sheet from one of Thorn's Cayman Islands shell corporations. It showed billions in liabilities being offset by assets described only as promissory notes, Tier 3. In layman's terms, IOUs from other ghosts. It was proof of nothing, yet it suggested everything. The journalist, smelling blood, published an article at 10 a.m. The headline was cautious but deadly. Questions swirl around Thorn Capital's offshore holdings. That's all it took. The dip became a slide. The slide became a freefall. I watched it all from my command center, a single monitor glowing with the red, downward trajectory of the stock ticker, TC. It was like watching a controlled demolition. I had planted the charges months ago. Now I was just observing the elegant, brutal physics of the collapse. The final charge was designed for maximum impact. At noon, as Thorn was likely screaming into multiple phones, trying to stop the bleeding, the Zurich legal firm made its official move. On behalf of LS Legacy Holdings, they filed a formal petition for immediate debt servicing. It was a public document. It stated in cold legal language that a single private entity now held all of Thorn Capital's outstanding debt and was exercising its right to call it in. All of it. Now, the market didn't just panic. It evaporated. Trading on Thorn Capital was halted within 10 minutes as the stock plummeted over 90%. Investors from massive pension funds to small-time millionaires Thorn had personally charmed stampeded for the exits, only to find the doors were locked and the building was on fire. I saw the first news flash on a live feed. A reporter standing in front of Thorn's gleaming Manhattan skyscraper. The cheer in red, Thorn Capital in crisis. Then came the image I'd been waiting for. Two men in dark suits with the letters SEC emblazoned on their jackets walked briskly through the revolving doors of Thorn's building. The raid was on. They knew. Someone from a three-letter agency. I still had friends and had been watching my digital breadcrumbs. They were just waiting for the public signal to move in. My signal. I leaned back in my chair and took a sip of coffee. I felt a strange sense of detachment, the same feeling I get after completing a complex structural plan. The math was correct. The execution was flawless. The result was inevitable. My encrypted phone buzzed on the table. A single text message from a number I knew belonged to a very powerful, very quiet man in Washington, D.C. A man for whom I had built several unbreakable things over the years. The message was 5 words. Clean work, Frank. Elegant as always. I deleted the message and powered down the phone. My work here was done. I hadn't destroyed Marcus Thorn. His own greed, his own arrogance had done that. I had simply built the mirror that forced him and the world to see the truth. I switched the monitor back to the blueprints of the Boston Library. Real work. Something that would still be standing 100 years from now. I wondered which choice my son would make. now that the kingdom he'd so desperately wanted lay in ruins at his feet. 3 weeks passed. The fall of Thorn Capital was a media spectacle, a brief, glorious bonfire of wealth and hubris for the public to warm their hands by before moving on to the next scandal. Marcus Thorn was out on bail, his face a haggard mask on the courthouse steps, a stark contrast to the confident titan at the wedding. The financial world had already forgotten him, moving on to feast on the carcass of his empire. Amelia, caught between the father she idolized and the husband who now held the keys to his prison cell, had fled. A short, formal email to Leo informed him she was with family in Switzerland, trying to understand. The subtext was clear. Their fairy tale was over. Leo was adrift. His new father was a criminal. His wife was gone. His glittering future had vanished in the space of a single news cycle. I knew he would come. Sooner or later, when you're truly lost, you always go home. The question was, which home would he look for? He showed up at the construction office first. I saw him from my truck as I was pulling up. He looked smaller, diminished. His expensive suit was wrinkled. His Yale posture had slumped into a defeated slouch. He looked like a boy wearing his father's clothes. My foreman, Dave, was there. "Mr. Miller's not here," I heard Dave say gruffly. "Dave has no time for suits. He's on site." "Which site?" Leo asked, his voice thin. Dave just grunted and pointed to a piece of paper I'd tacked to the bulletin board. On it, I'd written a single address. The address of the warehouse. An hour later, I heard the sound of an Uber pulling up outside my workshop. I watched on a security feed as Leo got out, looked at the decrepit, imposing structure, and hesitated. This was not the world he knew. This was a place of rust and shadows, a world away from the manicured lawns of Greenwich. He took a breath and walked to the service door. It slid open for him. I had already authorized his biometrics. He stepped inside and froze, his mouth slightly agape. The cool, humming darkness of the command center was a stark shock. He took in the bank of monitors, the schematics, the quiet, immense power of the room. He looked at me, standing by the central table in my work clothes. For a long moment, he said nothing. He was processing the impossible cognitive dissonance. The father he knew, the simple builder, standing in a room that looked like it belonged to a spy movie. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "All my life, I thought you were just a contractor." "I am," I said, my voice even. "I build things. Some are made of concrete. Others are made of information. The principles are the same. A solid foundation, structural integrity, and knowing exactly how much weight it can bear before it collapses." He walked further into the room, his eyes scanning everything, trying to piece together a puzzle he never knew existed. He saw the file on the screen labeled Project Air. He saw the market data from the day Thorn fell. He saw the satellite maps and encrypted communication logs. The evidence of my other life was all around him. He sank into a chair, looking utterly defeated. The anger was gone, the bravado from the wedding a distant, pathetic memory. All that was left was a raw, aching confusion. "Why?" he asked, the single word encompassing a lifetime of questions. "Why did you let me believe all of it? Why did you never tell me?" It was the first real question he had ever asked me. I walked over to the coffee machine, poured 2 mugs, and pushed one across the oak table to him. He stared at it as if he'd never seen coffee before. "Tell you what, Leo," I began, leaning against the table, "that I spent 20 years designing systems for people who believe borders are suggestions and laws are for the little guy. That your college tuition was paid for by repatriating the assets of a dictator after a coup. That the reason I missed your championship game was because I was in a server farm in the middle of the Nevada desert preventing a meltdown of the entire West Coast power grid. What would you have done with that information?" He had no answer. He just shook his head slowly. "You would have talked," I said, not as an accusation, but as a statement of fact. Not out of malice, but out of pride. You would have wanted to impress your friends from the yacht club, to prove your simple, blue-collar father was more than he seemed. And you would have put a target on your own back, on your mother's, on mine. The greatest protection I ever gave you, the most important structure I ever built, was my own anonymity. My simplicity was your fortress, Leo. You just hated the way it looked from the inside. I let the words settle in the quiet hum of the servers. This wasn't about scolding him. It was about giving him the blueprints he never had. Men like Marcus Thorne, I continued, they build with flash and mirrors. Their empires look impressive from a distance, all glass and chrome. But get up close, and you see they're built on sand. One good push, one stiff wind, and the whole thing comes crashing down. That's not strength. It's an illusion of strength. I build with granite and steel. What I build is meant to last. It's not always pretty. Sometimes from the outside, it just looks like a boring, windowless warehouse. But solid. It's real. He finally looked up at me, his eyes filled with a dawning, horrified understanding. He was seeing his entire life, his entire perception of me, reframed. The shame he felt for me was turning inward, transforming into shame for his own blindness. What you did to him, it was so. He struggled for the word. Surgical. Cold. It was structural. I corrected him gently. I identified a critical design flaw, and I applied the precise amount of pressure needed to trigger a controlled demolition. It wasn't about anger. Anger is a sloppy tool. This was about architecture. His continued existence was a threat to our foundation. I removed the threat. I walked to a large, flat file cabinet in the corner and pulled out a thick, bound document. I placed it on the table in front of him. It was a complete financial portfolio. This is for you, I said. It's a trust. The principal is untouchable, but the interest it generates will provide you with more money than you could ever spend in 10 lifetimes. It's clean, legal, and completely firewalled from any of my other projects. You can take it, disappear, and start over anywhere in the world. Change your name. Find a new life. Forget all of this. He stared at the document, at the promise of an easy escape. The life he always thought he wanted was right there, printed on heavy bond paper. Or, I said, my voice softening slightly, there's another option. I slid another set of papers across the table. They weren't financial statements. They were blueprints. The plans for the Boston Library restoration. You can stay, I said. You can put on a pair of work boots, and you can learn how to build something real. From the ground up. You can learn the difference between the illusion of power and the reality of strength. It's hard work. It's dirty. It doesn't come with stock options or a corner office. But what you build will last. The choice, as it was with Thorne, is yours. He looked from the trust fund to the blueprints, from the easy escape to the difficult path. It was the most important choice of his life, and for the first time, he was making it with his eyes wide open. He wasn't just choosing a career. He was choosing what kind of man he was going to be. He was choosing his own foundation. 1 year later, the autumn light in Boston is different. It's softer, filtered through a history that seems to cling to the old brick and cobblestone. We were standing in what would one day be the main reading room of the revitalized Copley Library. For now, it was a cavern of scaffolding, dust motes dancing in the sunbeams, slanting through the tall, arched windows. Leo was not the same man. The softness was gone from his face, replaced by a focused competence. His hands, like mine, were now mapped with the beginnings of calluses. He wore a dusty Carhartt jacket and steel-toed boots, and he wore them not like a costume, but like a second skin. He was crouched down, examining the new foundation work at the base of a massive granite load-bearing wall. He ran his hand over the mortar, checking the consistency, his brow furrowed in concentration. He wasn't barking orders. He was learning. He'd spent the last year doing every job on the site, from hauling debris to drafting revisions to the plans on a laptop caked in grime. He absorbed it all with a quiet, relentless hunger. We didn't talk much about what had happened. There was no grand reconciliation, no tearful apologies. We didn't need them. Our understanding wasn't being built with words, but with shared work, with the silent language of a level line and a true right angle. He stood up, brushing the dust from his jeans. "The mix is good," he said to Dave, who stood nearby, watching with a critical, but now respectful eye. "Solid." Dave just nodded, the highest form of praise from the old foreman. Leo looked at me. "The cornerstone is ready to be set." We walked outside to where a crane was holding a massive, newly cut block of Quincy granite. On its face, a simple inscription had been carved. AD 2024. A new beginning. A new layer of history. Leo directed the crane operator with precise hand signals, guiding the stone down, inch by inch, into the space that had been prepared for it. It settled into its mortar bed with a deep, satisfying thud. The sound of permanence. He took up a trowel, scraped away the excess mortar with a practiced hand, and then laid his palm flat on the stone's cool, solid surface. He closed his eyes for a moment, as if feeling the strength of the entire structure flow up from the earth. I stood back and watched my son. He hadn't chosen the money. He hadn't run. He had chosen to learn the architecture of the real world. Sarah's voice echoed in my memory, a gentle whisper on the autumn wind. Be patient with him, Frank. I thought about the nature of my work. For most of my life, I had been an architect of the unseen, of systems, secrets, and demolitions. But standing here, watching my son lay the first stone of a new foundation, both for this building and for his own life, I realized this was the most important project I had ever undertaken. Sometimes, to build something that will truly last, you have to let the old structure, the one built on lies and illusions, fall completely to the ground. You have to clear away the rubble, find the bedrock, and then, with your own two hands, lay the first true stone.